Hello, everybody. Today's talk is on blockchain security guarantees and exploits. From what I understand, there is a live Q&A session going right now as this talk is being streamed. So I'll be in here, happy to take any questions as this talk is going on. My name is Adrian Bednarik. I am the CISO at Overflow Labs. I am into reverse engineering weird stuff, anything from proprietary protocols, obfuscated code, digital assets, anything blockchain-y, and virtual economies. I have a pretty long history in exploiting virtual economies. And what that basically means is reverse engineering how they work, reverse engineering how the technology behind them works, how the client to server communication works, and how that could be manipulated to create functionality into a system that was beyond the intention of the developers. And I've participated in virtual economies of MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. Some of them include World of Warcraft, which is pretty familiar with a lot of people, Shadowbane, Rift, Ultima Online, WildStar, Elder Scrolls Online, and a couple dozen more. Today's agenda will be blockchain, mainly Ethereum, but also Bitcoin, and any blockchain that uses elliptical curve cryptography. We will take a fun, brief and quick cryptographic primitive crash course. It's a very math-intensive field. It takes years before a cryptographic mechanism is vetted. There is a lot of peer review. And once it is vetted by the peers and it's released to the public, there's a sink or swim public adaptation. You know, is it easy to use by developers? Is it not resource intensive on competing devices? Is it easy to use? Are there a lot of foot shots that developers can make mistakes on? A lot of cryptographic systems fail and a lot of them succeed. It's kind of a roll of the dice. And then we also talk about exploiting a weakness, specifically on the Ethereum blockchain. But again, this could apply to any blockchain that uses ECC. Why this talk? Why now? Again, blockchain, it's not going away. And even when using the right tools, mistakes will be made. But we will still blame the tools. That's the age-old way of thinking. It's never my fault, it's always the tool's fault. We will examine the importance of randomness and cryptographic private keys. And then for the fun side of things, we will examine how we stumbled into somebody we dubbed the blockchain bandit that possesses over $100 million worth of stolen loot. So this talk is based on some research I did at my previous job at ISE, Independent Security Evaluators. And the timeline is this. In August 2018, I started this project called Ethercombing, and it was basically how to find private keys on the public blockchain. We will go into the details of that throughout this talk. In January of 2019, a white paper was drafted, and I found out how fun it is to create white paper drafts and go over many revisions until it's massaged into something that looks and feels like a white paper that's worth publishing. In February of 2019, we were faced with a question: do we publish this? Anytime you're doing research, especially research that's related to the security field and the security of systems, by publishing it, you always have to ask yourself, will you give the bad guys ammo? Will they take this research and use it to cause harm? So we mulled around on it for a little bit, and then we did some tests, and through our testing, we found that this was being exploited actively in the wild. So by publishing it, you know, we raise awareness and help protect people. So in April of 2019, we went and published a white paper, and it got picked up by, I think, Wired.com, and then it got picked up by a dozen or so other news outlets. In early of 2021, I started a new company with some friends called Overflow, and we did a refresh on the original research, and that's what we're presenting on right now. So let's get over with the boring and fun stuff, depending on your perspective on cryptography and blockchain primitives. So common cryptographic concepts, we'll go through this very quickly. Asymmetric encryption. The key concept here is that you have a private key that encrypts and a public key that decrypts. Public key signing. data signed with a public key, a data signed with a private key can be verified with a public key. A hash function. A hash function takes a variable sized input and generates a random fixed length value. The most common one right now is SHA-256. Before that was SHA-128, which Google found a hash collision on. So SHA-128 is considered a broken hash function now because you're able to collide the hash result value. SHA-256 is still going good and strong. Entropy, one of the key concepts of this talk. Entropy is the measurement of randomness. If you have some random data, the random data's distribution should be uniform amongst all possible values. Here we see a green line in the graph. That's completely, laser pointing. That's completely flat. It's a uniform distribution. And if we sample the random data that's generated, you can see there's very minimal variations in this data. There's a lot of statistical tests to mathematically prove that something is random or not. But visually, you can take a glimpse and say, hey, this looks pretty random because it matches the continuous uniform line. Again, if you have something that's low entropy, the deviation between the sampled random data and the expected continuous uniform random data is going to be obvious. There's going to be obvious deviations. And if you were to map this random data to a three-dimensional cube, and we'll go back to the previous slide, completely random data should appear to be like volumetric fog, like if you had a cube of just like mist or fog. If there is a low entropy system generating random numbers, the entropy will be obvious. Like here you can see like little dark markings here, which indicates that things aren't random as they should be. And this is a huge rabbit hole. The elliptical curve digital signature algorithm. It's kind of the foundation of a lot of blockchains. Specifically, Ethereum and Bitcoin use a specific curve primitive called SECP256K1. Nearly all other blockchains use this or some other variation of it. And the gist here is that you create a private key to create a point on the curve, and that point on the curve is used to calculate a different point on the curve. That second point, you cannot do any math or you cannot derive that first point. So the second point on the curve cannot be used to work backwards and find the first point on the curve, which was derived from your private key. That's kind of a key concept. So with all these concepts, we have the blockchain, ta-da. The transactions are secured by hashing and signing. The critical input to a blockchain stems from a user-generated private key. And it's highlighted in red here because we are about to dive in what happens if there are mistakes made. So, blockchain addresses and private keys. This is a lot of data, but we'll walk through from top to bottom. So on the top here, you have a randomly generated private key. To get a public Ethereum address, it's essentially 3 steps. One, you have the private key. Then you use the elliptical curve SECP256K1 derivation to get your public key. Then you perform a hash function. Ethereum uses Keccak256 to hash the public key to a value, which is here. Then the lower 20 bytes of this value is your Ethereum address. And this is the address that's public that you give to your friend and be like, hey, please pay me some Ethereum to this address. This is the address in red here that you give to them. So let's go through again, step by step. So step 1, you generate the private key. Here we have 32 random bytes. Step 2, you derive the elliptical curve public key from the private key. So you do the SECPK256K1 transformation to get a public key, and then you get a 64-byte value back. Then you take the 64-byte value, and then you perform a hash on it through Jack 256, and then you get 32 bytes back. The lower 24 bytes, highlighted in yellow here, is your Ethereum address. It's pretty straightforward if you abstract it away like that. The math behind this is very complex and would take dozens of years to study. So anyway, private keys are supposed to be random. We know errors can be made. From here on, a little caution here, exclaimer, this isn't the sky is falling moment. So 2 disclaimers. From here on, the focus is on the Ethereum blockchain, but the same concepts apply to other ECDSA blockchains such as Bitcoin, EOS, Dash, NEO, XRP, and a dozen or so others. The journey here that we're about to take over the next dozen or so slides will show that we were able to discover weak private keys. Now, this doesn't mean that the blockchain Ethereum is broken or any other blockchain based on ECDSA is broken. It's just to highlight the importance of truly random private keys and verifying that private keys are generated randomly. So now what? We know how to create a private key. We know how to transform that private key to a public key using the ECDSA curve. And then we know how to derive an address from that. So let's play the hacker's favorite game, what if? Typically when attacking the system, that's the first thing I do, is I learn how the system works, and then I go, what if we do this? What if we do that? And then you test it out and see if you get unexpected behavior. So with this knowledge, let's play what if. What if we have errors in generating random keys? Errors in code are pretty common. Typically when you're running some code and you get an error, you get an error code. What happens if you use this error code as your private key? This does happen. What if you just by some chance create a private key of 1? Now this is a valid private key, which is interesting enough, but it's also highly unlikely. So let's take the private key of 1 and do all the proper transformations, and then we get a public key that starts in 75 and ends in BDF. And if we go to a blockchain explorer for Ethereum in this example again, we can see if any transactions occurred on this public key. So for a private key of 1, we can see that there are 635 transactions. So this is the aha moment where it gets interesting. Somebody used the private key of 1 and 635 transactions were committed on it. So what if we look at, the private keys of 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on? Remember that the private key space is 256 bits. That's roughly the amount of atoms in the universe. We can't possibly enumerate every single key in that key space because there isn't enough energy in the universe to do that. So what we did in this research is we broke the 256-bit key down into 8 32-bit chunks. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that. So here are the first 4 chunks that we scanned. So first we scanned 32 bits in this very first part of this key. It's called 32 bits, it's called a D word in computer lingo. So we scanned the first D word, then we scanned the second D word, third D word, fourth D word, and going forward, fifth D word, sixth D word, seventh D word, eighth D word. And just to make it crystal clear, so each highlighted range is 32 bits, and that's roughly 4.2 billion possible private keys in each range. So to make this more concrete, the first group, the range is going to be from 1 to FF, 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 and FF is hexadecimal for 4.2 billion, and I forgot the rest. It's like 4.29 billion. So we did the same thing in group B. We just offset everything to the next D word in the key space, and so on in group C, and group D, E, F, and G, and H, I think. Anyway, so we ended up scanning around 32 billion keys. And I kind of joke about this because to scan 32 billion keys, it's a pretty resource-intensive task. For a single core on a computer, you can scan about, well, in an unoptimized way, I was running Node.js. I was scanning about 30,000 keys per second. So what I did was I spun this up in the cloud, and Google was nice enough to give you cloud credits for new accounts. So they gave me $300 worth of credits. And I was like, sweet, I'll use this to scan the Ethereum key space to find weak private keys. So basically what I did is turned a $300 worth of credit into finding emptied blockchain wallets. And we'll go dive into that next. So the results. In Group A, from the private key of 1 to 4.2 billion, we scanned every single one. We found a few hundred private keys. Each dot represents a match for a key that was used to conduct a transaction on the public blockchain. So for example, right here on the line, you see the private key of 1 was used. And there's a very interesting obvious pattern around here. And this is around the FF range in hexadecimal. And that's the upper bound of an 8-bit hexadecimal byte, which is somewhat interesting because after you go past that point, it gets pretty sparse. I'm not sure why that is. It's just something interesting to note. The center groups, B, C, D, E, F, and G, we found only 4 keys. And here they are plotted at the respective opposites. There's a big red arrow pointing to this key. This is a very interesting key that I'll get to in a couple of slides. Just remember the big red arrow pointing to that guy and this guy. We'll reference that guy and this guy over and over again in a little bit. So Group H, the very last group in the 256-bit key space, we did the same thing, scanning 4.2 billion keys in that key space, and we found a couple hundred more keys. And most of them seem to be clustered, very close to the upper bound of that D word. If we were to reverse this graph, it would probably be the same case as in the first group, where most of the keys were within that first byte. There's probably some little endianness going around where things get shuffled around based on how the keys are generated and things like that. But that's another rabbit hole to dive down as to why these keys are grouped in certain ways. So the full results, we found 732 private keys. These keys were involved in 50,000 transactions. And this is Ethereum, so they did have tokens associated with them. And there were 60 million tokens that were actually active. Like you could have gone in and transferred all these tokens out, but most of them were like spam tokens that really didn't have any value. So nobody really bothered to interact with these. And originally, when we conducted this research, we thought we would find some Ethereum, which would present an interesting legal and ethical problem. When you interact with a blockchain and you generate a private key, the key space is known. Your private key is going to be some value between 1 and the upper bound of a 256-bit number. What if you, by chance, come across a private key that somebody else used? Technically, it's found property out in public, or finders keepers, losers keepers. I don't know if that concept applies in the blockchain, but there's some interesting legal implications on what to do if, on the off chance you generate a bit or a cryptocurrency wallet, and then you happen to see that your wallet, the wallet that you thought was brand new, has a balance. Let's say you create a Bitcoin wallet and it has 10,000 Bitcoin in it because your private key collided with somebody else's private key. What are the ethics of, dealing with that situation? I think it's pretty interesting. But anyway, we found 732 private keys, a lot of transactions, and a zero balance. And this is the totality of our findings. in this cool little chart. So anyway, that awkward moment when you bump into a real bad guy. Remember this guy, that guy. So that represents an offset in the key space of group G. We know the private key. The public key is this. So again, what we're looking at here is a transaction from somebody to somebody with a pretty small value, about $7. The from is a private key that we know because we happens to collide with it. Somebody transferred money out of that known private key to somewhere else, to this address that starts in 957 and ends 464. We were interested, who is that guy? So we went on the Blockchain Explorer and we punched in that address, and we found out that that person that interacted with a private key that we also found and looted $7 worth of Ethereum from it, that guy has a balance of 44,000 Ethereum, which today is worth $105 million. Digging around some more, we found that this person that was basically vacuuming up or siphoning or looting, stealing is a strong word, basically finding key collisions in the private key space, was taking little bits of Ethereum here and there in an automated fashion. What we did one day is test to see how active this person is. So we created a new wallet within a key space that exists in a part of the key space that is known to have bad entropy. So anyway, we created a wallet with a bad private key, and we sent $1 to it, and instantly this guy took that $1 out of it within half a second. So this person is looking or monitoring for weak private keys in an automated fashion, and he's very successful at it because he's got over $100 million. And that's all we know. We can't. The identity of this person is not known, and he's still active. As of last night, I was checking, and he was still active. So it's pretty interesting. It could be a bot somebody forgot about, and their bot that is stealing or looting these private keys is amassing hundreds of millions of dollars without knowledge. Who knows? It'll be an interesting story one day when it comes out. So what else? We enumerated a bunch of private keys. We found transactions that were committed on them. We found a bad guy that was like looting all of these keys with over $100 million in his wallet. So what else can we look at? We know that the address is derived from a Keccak 256 hash of the public key. But what if the public key is null, which happens a lot in programming land? You initialize a variable and you forget to set it to a value. So you have a null public key, and then you hash it, and then you get a valid looking hash. The hash starts in DCC and ends in 470. We looked this up and we saw that there was 42 transactions performed on an address that was derived from a null public key. And this address has a balance of 815 Ether, which is about $1.4 million. And this is money lost forever because I'm not sure how you define the public or private key that would collide with an address derived from a null public key. That's another interesting rabbit hole to dive down into. And to this address that was derived from a null public key, there were some pretty big transactions. I redacted the name here because it was of a major exchange that's based here in the US. Through their transaction history, they sent 150 Ether, and then they sent, a fraction of Ether, and then they sent 323 more. So that's about $1 million worth of Ether that were lost by accident by a major exchange, which is pretty interesting. So like I said, this was based on research that was conducted in 2019, and here we are in 2021. What changed? Back then, we discovered 732 private keys. Now we discovered 859. Back then, there were 49,000 transactions. Now we have almost 57,000 transactions. Back then, we found 32 looted Ethereum. Now we found 228 looted Ethereum, meaning that if back in 2019 we kept our software running and then we found all these private keys and then we monitored transactions going into these private keys, we could have looted, close to 400,000 plus dollars, but somebody else is doing that. So the gist of this story is that private keys are high value assets. One way people go about protecting their private keys is to generate paper wallets. Typically, the way you do this is you download some open source software, you put it on a USB stick, and then you walk over into an offline computer to generate the private key and the public key, and then you get like a piece of paper you can print out or jot down or whatever that will have your private key that never touched an internet connected computer, which is really important. And then you can like cut this off and share the public address, because if you want to receive funds, you can share this with your friends on the internet, your blog, whatever, say, hey, send me some Ethereum. The key concept here is that the private key exists on an offline computer that never touched the internet. You think that's pretty safe, right? So we saw two instances where paper wallets were compromised. The first one, which is pretty interesting, bitcoinpaperwallet.com. The developer injected malicious code into the source code that was very obfuscated and hard to audit. And when people eventually figured out what this obfuscated code was doing, was basically generating random seeds or random private keys in a deterministic way that was known only to the attacker. So even though you ran the software on an offline computer, a computer that never touched the internet, the way those private keys were generated were known to his algorithm. Therefore, he was able to reproduce the same thing on his end to find key collisions. And this has been discovered to be active since 2018. Over $6 million US dollars were stolen. And as of right now, I believe this is an ongoing investigation. The other interesting case is IOTASeed.io. IOTA, I think, was or is another cryptocurrency. Again, it's an open source project, which I think is pretty funny because people usually think open source, it's more secure because there's more eyes on it, right? But if everybody says the exact same thing, then nobody's looking at it. So it was an exploit that was implanted into the source code. People assumed it was open source, so they were like, this must be legit because there's a lot of eyes on this. But it turns out people didn't really want to dive into what this obfuscated code was doing because it looks pretty innocent. But again, the same result was there, is that this obfuscated code was generating random keys in a deterministic way that were only known to the attacker. So the attacker could reproduce the random key generation on his computer to create key collisions. And this person stole over $10 million, and I do believe he was arrested by Interpol. I do believe he was in Germany. So he's having a court battle right now. Other interesting threats against offline key generation, side channel emissions. So we're all familiar with like Spectre and all these hardware bugs that allow processes to snoop in on privileged processes and how they're processing and read memory from privileged areas of the system. But here's a completely different way of attacking things, and that's using electromagnetic emissions from, let's say, your DVI cable or maybe your HDMI cable. HDMI might be a little bit more complicated since the signal is typically encrypted, but definitely VGA, DVI, and other cables like that you connect to your monitor. People are able to use off-the-shelf software to spy on these radio emissions from a distance as much as like 90 to 100 feet. And they use the software that was created by this guy. The software is called Tempest SDR. So use some off-the-shelf hardware, use this software called Tempest SDR, and you are able to recreate what somebody else sees on the monitor from up to 100 feet away. So in this example, this monitor on the left is displaying an example of a password. And on the right, you can see the Tempest SDR software using off-the-shelf hardware to recreate what the other monitor is displaying. It's not very clear, but it's clear enough. And if you had better hardware, fine-tune the software a little bit more, you could get a pretty accurate representation of what's on the screen. So if you are dealing with high-value assets that are protected by, private keys, passwords, any piece of data that can give you access to those high-value assets, you always have to consider, is the equipment I'm using able to transmit visible data, outside my building, outside my room, and things like that. You have to understand all the possible threat vectors. And I thought this one was pretty interesting, especially since they were able to use off-the-shelf equipment to snoop or spy on screens from 100 feet away. So what now? It's also interesting that blockchains have built-in bug bounties. And what I mean by that is blockchains hold a lot of valuable data, and so they're being attacked constantly. If you find an exploit in the blockchain, any weakness can be monetized within minutes or instantly. There's a really good article called Ethereum is a Dark Forest that kind of illustrates this example, where there are basically essentially bots that are running automated fuzzing on transactions, smart contracts, and other blockchain-specific technologies to automatically discover exploits and then siphon funds out. Traditional software, SaaS services, and anything that handles valuable data is a target, especially when you're talking about, a 256-bit key that protects a lot of assets. So what next? How could you apply what we talked about here in this talk? The main thing is to audit and verify. Use well-known cryptographic libraries and primitives. The old saying in crypto is, don't roll your own crypto. And that's true for a reason, because it's very easy to make mistakes. Audit number generators. This is an interesting one, but you only want to use cryptographically secure random number generation methods. And that's true for blockchains. And let's say if you're building some software that serves web data or manages sessions, you don't want your sessions to collide. You don't want somebody logging in and getting a session based on a bad random number that will collide with somebody else's session. Because I've seen this in the past where customer A will log in and they will see customer B's data. Get into some interesting issues and a lot of paperwork. One way to avoid this is to use multiple sources of entropy. The other thing you can do is perform regular static analysis on source code and do runtime dynamic analysis on the binaries that the source code generates. Because static analyzers are pretty good at picking up the obvious things, but doing dynamic analysis on what's actually generated and testing and benchmarking the functionality to make sure it's within the spec that the developers designed. It's really important to verify that at runtime also. And you also want to bake security into CI/CD pipelines. Do use static analysis tools. And when distributing high-value builds or builds that are used by a large number of people, do use deterministic builds to verify that the code supply pipeline wasn't compromised at some point by a malicious insider. You want to have a consensus on, yes, this thing was built and all of our builds match and are therefore verified, and therefore we can ship it. Do's and don'ts, mostly do's. Do enforce signed commits. I've seen the case where a developer was compromised and their workstation was used to commit code to their GitHub repo, which was then later distributed out to the public, and it did some pretty good harm. Did some pretty good harm out there. Do review code merges and pull requests. I've seen several cases where people just merge a pull request in without, thoroughly reviewing the code, and malicious code gets introduced into the system. I've seen this a couple of times. So it's really important to do thorough code reviews, especially when you're dealing with data that's being introduced from, let's say, an open source project or a community project. Do harden workstations, especially in today's, home office environment. Like in the first point, we've seen the workstation being compromised that was used to commit code to a GitHub repo that was then used to distribute code in a widespread way. When dealing with cryptographic systems, do review the NIST cryptographic standards and guidelines. I have a link here. It's a really long PDF. It's good reading material if you want to fall asleep. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages of really good guidance on how to use cryptographic systems, what to look for, and things like that. Do follow NIST recommended test suites. Whenever you're building something, you want to test individual components that you're building your software with, and the NIST recommended test suites will help you, will help guide you through that whole process. But in the end, awareness is the key. Outside the box thinking is crucial. Check the box compliance is secondary. And what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of systems where the auditors passed everything, all the boxes were checked, it met all the requirements, but then doing a hands-on assessment or sending it off to an assessment company, and it comes back with critical issues in the system. So check the box compliance is nice for its own purposes, but you always have to test and verify the system that it can't be compromised. And my final word is that if you create novel technologies, then people will find novel ways to exploit them. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you.